I think we'll get going because it looks like we have a good crowd here so far. So thank you all for joining us today for the first Canadian Association for Food Law and Policy webinar in our Food Futures webinar series. We're so delighted that you've joined us. The webinar today is going to be about questions of food insecurity and food security around the globe and issues of trade. And it's, again, as I've said, the first in what we hope will be a series of webinars. And the broad purpose of our webinar series is we were going to have our 5th Food Law and Policy Conference in November of this year, but we had to cancel it or postpone it because of COVID-19. And we thought, wouldn't it be nice if we still had a way to engage with each other as a community and also to deal with some of the really pressing issues concerning our food systems that we could argue have been changed around as a result of the pandemic. I'm sure we all have different views on that, but I think it's very, very clear that regardless of whether or not we think we're in some new paradigm or not, that the pandemic has really exacerbated a number of inequalities around the world, and certain populations are feeling the effects of that more than others, and in particular in rising food insecurity. So our task for today is to think really about rising food insecurity and its relationship to trade. The state of food insecurity that in 2019, 690 million people around the globe, some 8.9% of the world population was living with food insecurity. And recent estimates have suggested that by the end of this year, that number will grow substantially, perhaps even by 130 million. And we all know that some of these estimates are vastly under-inclusive, and that it may be that rates are much higher than that actually. So today we're going to deal broadly with 3 questions related to trade and food insecurity. One is just looking at the measures that states have taken in response to the food crisis that's now emerging, and maybe comparing that a bit to the food crisis in 2009, 2007, 2008, 2009, and how these measures have impacted global food insecurity. Second, we're interested in exploring what our illustrious panel that Victoria will introduce after me think have what their views on the global architecture of supply chains, how those supply chains and our current trade systems, both globally and regionally, have impacted food insecurity and COVID-19 related food and health crises. And then finally, we're interested in the speakers' views on the benefits or the inadequacies of the global trade regime and its constitutive legal framework that COVID-19 has laid bare or exacerbated. And we have an amazing panel today. We're extremely lucky. So I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Victoria, to introduce them and share some rules about how this webinar will run. So thank you, Victoria.
So hi everyone and welcome. I'm just going to take a moment to kind of run through the layout quickly and then the Zoom logistics. Then I'll introduce the speakers and we can get started. So essentially we're going to start with about a 10 to 15 minute introduction from each of the speakers. And then after that, we'll turn to a Q&A and discussion portion. And so for this, if you have any questions that maybe you've thought of beforehand or that may arise over the course of the introductions, then you can share them with us in the chat, and then maybe just make a note beside the question that you have as to whether or not you would like to pose it yourself, or you would like Nadia or myself to ask it for you. And if you would like to speak yourself, then there's a function that kind of allows us to let you pose the question yourself when that situation arises. And just so that everyone knows, the webinar is also being recorded, and it will be shared on the Food Law on our website, which is foodlaw.ca, following the event, so that you can rewatch or share with your communities. So before turning things over, I'll briefly introduce each of the speakers and then let them go from there. So our first speaker today is Marie-Noëlle Desrochers, who joined Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in 2003 as a trade policy analyst and became the director of the Trade Negotiations Division in 2018. She took part in the negotiations of numerous trade agreements, including the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. She is currently the acting executive director of the Strategic Trade and Policy Division, and Ms. Desrochers has a degree in political science from the University of Ottawa and a master's in international affairs from the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Our second speaker for today will be Sophia Murphy. Ms. Murphy is the Senior Specialist on Agriculture, Trade, and Investment within the Economic Policy, Law and Policy Program at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. She is a leading commentator on food system and boasts an impressive publication record. Her work bridges issues of food sovereignty and trade. Ms. Murphy has also been a scholar of the WTO for many years, offering critical reflections on the direction of trade policy. Ms. Murphy is currently completing her PhD at the University of British Columbia in the Resource Management and Environmental Studies program at the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. Our final speaker for today will be Michael Fakhri, and he's currently a professor at the University of Oregon School of Law, where he teaches courses on human rights, food law, development, and commercial law. Mr. Fakhri has been exploring the connection between food systems and our current trade regime for over 10 years. His research focuses on the right to food and agroecology. As of May 1st, 2020, he has assumed his duties as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Mr. Fakhri holds a Bachelor of Science in Ecology from Western University, a Bachelor of Law from Queen's University, a Master's from Harvard Law School, and a Doctorate from the University of Toronto. So I'll now turn things over to Marie-Noëlle to get us started.
Can you hear me well? Well, hello everyone. I'm delighted to be here today to have a discussion about trade and food security during COVID-19. I'd like to thank the Canadian Association for Food Line Policy for organizing such a timely event. COVID-19 has tested the resilience of our food systems. Around the world, food supply chains, as well as people's livelihoods, have been disrupted by the pandemic, thereby threatening food security. So today I will focus my remarks on the international response to the crisis and the role that trade and trade rules play in regards to global food security. But I feel that it's important to quickly touch on Canada's domestic response. Though we have certainly faced challenges, the Government of Canada's response to this crisis has been swift and effective. In addition to assistance provided to individuals, for example, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, Canada has provided increased access to risk management programs and to capital for farmers and food processors, provided support for processing operations to safeguard the health and safety of workers, created an emergency fund for food security, which provides funding for food banks, and much more. The Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada website offers more information on the suite of financial and other assistance that has been provided to our industry in this extraordinary period. Although Canada has been able to respond to the pandemic, we appreciate that numerous challenges remain for food security at the international level. The FAO's State of Food and Security's preliminary assessment suggests that the COVID-19 pandemic may add between 83 and 132 million people to the total number of undernourished in the world in 2020. With disruptions across all sectors, the World Bank estimates that the pandemic's economic impact could push about 100 million people into extreme poverty. This is a serious risk of a global food emergency as access to food decreases because of loss of income, diminished labor force, and in some cases, a rise in food prices. So, what role does trade play in all this? Canada believes that having a predictable, rules-based trading system rooted in science-based regulations is critical to achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 2, and to ensuring the economic sustainability of our agriculture and agri-food sector, and to providing safe and nutritious food to Canadians and others around the world. The World Trade Organization is the cornerstone of Canada's trade agenda. It provides its members rights and obligations. It serves as the forum for multilateral negotiations, and it has mechanisms for monitoring commitments and settling disputes. The WTO is the most effective venue to address production and trade distorting domestic support. So I'm talking here about government programs that encourage production and other issues that are of key importance to Canada. Canada is, of course, also very active on the free trade agreement front. Canada's free trade agreements support building stronger connections with its trading partners via preferential market access commitments, and also free trade agreements set in place more ambitious trade rules and mechanisms to prevent and address non-tariff barriers to trade. As of today, Canada has 14 trade agreements covering 51 countries. And that represents nearly 2/3 of the world GDP and 1.5 billion of the world's population. So as the world's fifth largest importer and exporter of agricultural products, Canada is deeply committed to this system. We believe that not only does trade facilitate the movement of food, it also supports innovation, production, investment, and economic growth. This was true before the pandemic and even more important today. Now more than ever, food must be able to flow from areas of abundance to areas of scarcity, and all countries must resist the urge to turn inwards. COVID-19 prompted ad hoc trade restrictions as a preliminary policy response in several countries. Both import restrictions due to food safety concerns that are not necessarily science-based, and export restrictions due to concerns about domestic availability of food. We know from the experience of 2007 and 2008, and from the advice of experts, that this approach can cause food price hikes and can be detrimental to food security. On March 31st, the heads of the World Trade Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and the World Health Organization issued a joint statement calling on governments to minimize the impact of COVID-19 related border restrictions on trade in food. The FAO warns us that protectionist policy responses can aggravate the situation and exacerbate their impact on food markets. Their analysis also shows us that avoiding trade restrictive measures can be as important as direct forms of support to consumers and producers. The COVID-19 Response and Recovery Program of the FAO explains that to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic, it's crucial to facilitate and enhance trade, both within and among regions, and to improve access to markets. Even if a push towards self-sufficiency was the best way to deal with the COVID-19 crisis, taking steps away from predictable, rules-based international trade now would leave countries much more susceptible to the next crisis, be that the effects of climate change, natural disasters, droughts, pests, etc. There's a resilience in cooperation. So what is Canada doing? In addition to our international assistance program led by Global Affairs Canada, we are using every opportunity at the FAO, the WTO, the G20, APEC, and elsewhere to call for renewed commitment to international rules, to be transparent about what we're doing to manage COVID-19, and to better understand the domestic measures being put in place by our trading partners. To give you an example of Canadian actions, Canada took leadership in April of 2020 to have 23 WTO members sign onto a joint statement to reinforce international cooperation on trade in agricultural and agri-food products. This will help to protect and promote food security, nutrition, and the health of people around the world. So in this statement, members committed to not imposing agriculture export restrictions or implementing unjustified trade barriers. We must rise to the current challenge that we face and safeguard the international trading system that we have. Unfortunately, that system was facing challenges even before the pandemic, with the enforceability of trade rules being threatened and more non-tariff barriers being erected around the world. Canada has taken a lead role on WTO reform generally, with its work in the Ottawa Group as an example, and on advancing negotiations on agriculture in particular. And we continue to pursue an active FTA agenda. Progress in these fronts would represent an enormous opportunity for Canada. We're also committed to demonstrating that a rules-based trading system is fully compatible with pursuing policy outcomes related to eliminating food insecurity, promoting nutrition, combating climate change, increasing resilience. Indeed, these are the intended outcome of a food policy for Canada, and we are pursuing them while not only complying with international trade rules, but actively working to safeguard and improve those rules. Moreover, the multilateral rules do take into consideration the food security needs of member countries, from rules on export competition, including the elimination of export subsidies, to rules on international food aid, to the Bali ministerial decision on public stock holding for food security purposes. The system has and will continue to focus on these important issues. We will continue to work with our partners across the world to foster meaningful dialogue on the issue of trade and food security in the context of COVID-19. Canada looks forward to the upcoming UN Food Systems Summit in 2021 as one very prominent forum to address these challenges. And I look forward to discussing these issues with the other distinguished panelists and the virtual audience today. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Marine, for all of that great canvassing of what we've seen here in Canada and abroad. And now I'll turn things over to Sophia Murphy.
Thank you so much, Victoria, Marie-Noël, for starting us off. I'm going to try to share screen, so bear with me a moment to link to a PowerPoint presentation. That's just mostly to help guide my thoughts. So I wanted to try and cover some of these things. There's a lot to cover, and the time is never enough, of course, so just put a timer on. But broadly, what I wanted to try and get through for myself was, for this talk, was some of the global impact. We've touched on it a few times, and not just to the disease, of course, but to the government responses to the disease, which have had important implications for hunger. A few thoughts just on shocks more generally, and then come to the role of trade. And I'll spend some time comparing the two crises that the association pulled out for our talk today, because I think there's some good lessons for us there, and get in towards what's next for trade rules. But Michael will be able to pick up, because he's also just been spending a lot of time thinking about and writing about that. So that will come next. I guess you all see what I'm seeing, which I'm not used to with this. Okay, here goes. So broadly, 4 things. So we've looked at some of this, the numbers here, basically very quickly from when the global pandemic was declared to appreciating the risk of a food security crisis in the country. It didn't take long for people to be aware of that. And we had 2 things. One, monitoring almost from the get-go, which we didn't have in 2007, 2008. That's partly technology, I think, partly lessons learned. But very quickly, there were trackers looking at who was imposing export bans, where were the problems at the border, also just where was hunger arising, and how were governments responding. And Ugo Gentilini at the World Bank, working with ILO, working with UNICEF and other agencies, began to count all of these social protection measures that were going in. And so there was a lot of real-time information for us to understand this crisis. These charts that I'm sharing now are, of course, based on still projections. This isn't perfect counting. This is just understanding, trying to make sense of what's going on, using probably on the conservative side, a 95 million potential increase in who would be food insecure. And just to point out that that won't be everywhere and everyone. It's especially in—
I'm not seeing your slide, Sophia.
Oh, it says that I'm screen sharing and it's not. Okay.
We just see the outline slide, not the graphs. We can see the graphs coming up, but we're not seeing them.
Oh, that's okay. So if I go to the next slide, that's good. So this doesn't change anything. Okay, so I'm sorry. It says I'm screen sharing, but it's somehow not working. So I won't worry. Basically, the snapshot then is showing that it's in sub-Saharan Africa, it's projecting 11% increase, and in South Asia, 20% increase. So those are large increases in the number of hungry, and that it will be slightly bigger in rural areas than in urban areas, and that's probably to do with the how well the social protection programs reach people in rural areas. The other thing I wanted to show you is what people eat will change. So it's clear that as people's income is cut, the effect of the crisis will be probably an increase even of some of the food staple consumed, and a drop on all of the fruits and vegetables, meat, fish, the foods that provide a better nutritional basis for people's diets. So you have this big global impact of the crisis. You have it on a backdrop where hunger has been increasing over the last 5 years. So really important gains in ending hunger measured globally over a 20-year period. But the last 5 years quite troubling, with an increase in hunger that's ascribed to climate change, in part to economic shocks localized in certain parts of the world, and due to conflict as well. So that's, but with the COVID crisis, the risk that we would lose up to 20 years of the recent gains in tackling these numbers of people who live in food insecurity. So the scale of the problem is very significant. I think in Canada, for most industrialized countries, our food systems broadly worked. They're food systems that are very integrated. They have global food supply chains. And on the whole, once the panic died down, once we figured out how to turn 100-kilo bags of flour into 5-kilo bags of flour that could be sold in a supermarket, you know, there was a big redirection of food from the food service sector in restaurants into supermarkets. I think most people who had income were confident that they weren't going to go hungry in industrialized countries. What it was really striking, though, it was how it highlighted all the fragilities and inequalities in the food system that we have. It was really obvious who was going to work and who wasn't, who was an essential worker and who wasn't, who was allowed across the border, migrant workers, to work in a greenhouse or in a field, and nobody else. And I think that for a lot of people who maybe hadn't seen what the food system depends upon in terms of quite concentrated market power, very poorly paid essential workers, and quite unjust migrant worker programs, it became hard not to see that, because that's where COVID outbreaks happened. That's where, as I say, that's where exceptions were made on who could cross a border. And I think, for me personally, at least quite egregiously, the decision to pay more to supermarket workers introduced in April to recognize frontline workers, that's taken away in June, not because the supermarkets aren't making record profits, which they are, but because it's a decision that actually the crisis has in some way waned and people don't deserve those extra $1 or $2 an hour for the jobs that they do. So I would say on the whole, quite a strong and important response. I agree, Mary Noel, but a response that was perhaps feeding into the system that we already have. You know, there were far too many potatoes for French fries. We had to do something with those potatoes. But in a crisis, you're not really in a good place to rethink whether it's a great idea that so many potatoes are grown to make French fries, and whether we need to be establishing McCain's, you know, potato chip market in Sub-Saharan Africa, or whether maybe we need to be doing something else with the land in Prince Edward Island. So this, moving to the second part about the shocks more generally, the shocks are really important catalysts, I think. And if you know, with a historic perspective, you see what you can change, what has changed as a result of shocks. But in the shock, it's not a good time to create things. And I'll come back to that with the comparison. I think we did learn important things from 2007-8 that stood us in good stead this time around. But you see, for example, for Canada, we don't have our National Food Council yet, so we had no way to bring other actors to the table, and our government response reflects the traditional constituencies of Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, important constituencies, farm organizations, agri-processing industries, but not consumer groups, not environmental organizations, not Health Canada. You know, you aren't going to do that in a crisis. Then the other thing to say about the shocks is that we should be ready. I think that there are many kinds of shocks. And so I think the global integration that we experience in the global supply chains we have are both a strength and a weakness. So it really resonates when Marianne says resilience comes in cooperation. I think that's very true. But we saw that we didn't have resilience in the food systems we had. We didn't have enough redundancy. And so that was short-term sort of weaknesses, but for some others it becomes a long-term problem. If there's no redundancy and you don't have a lot of purchasing power in the international market, then you're not able to have your demand heard. And again, I'll come back to that. It was an issue in 2007, 2008, and continues to be an issue. So I think the whole idea of these global value chains and how we assess them won't be to kind of do a thumbs up or a thumbs down, but to keep revisiting what they do to risk and to keep understanding where else do we then need to provide measures to ensure that people don't fall through the cracks, as it were. I don't think that in the long run we can continue with the global distribution of our food production, though, without much better social and environmental safeguards. And so there's a challenge out, which I know even at the WTO is being heard, to really understand how we start to discriminate properly and not just accept that lowest common denominator is all we're going to get from the system. The food system is partly fragile because of the demands it makes on global resources on the planet's natural resource base. So if we, this is so awkward, I'm talking you through things that I'm looking at, but I think if we think about the 2007-2008 food prices and just recap briefly, that was about supply shortfalls, low stocks to use, meaning not much food in reserve, especially in public stocks. There was a sort of underlying shift in demand as gradually Asia became the largest food importer, and also created by these biofuel mandates as developed countries tried to find a way to soak up unwanted crop production. And that created a flip where the shortfall in supply and this underlying long-term trend in increasing demand changed how those market actors understood where commodity prices should be. And it created very sharp, volatile price increases, and it had a big impact a negative impact on hunger and food insecurity in a lot of parts of the world. In the long run, though, it had a couple of positive outcomes. One is that higher commodity prices was good on the whole for rural areas. It was good on the whole for many countries that relied on agricultural exports for their income. And you saw that in higher wages to rural workers. You saw that in some kinds of, and higher budgets, higher revenues for some countries as well. And you saw a big increase in investment in domestic food production, and a lot of reluctance around that at the WTO that we need to sort out. But I think from a food security perspective, a lot of countries that were underperforming in agriculture began to try and figure that out. In contrast to that whole picture in 2020, we've got, much more normal supplies of food, especially at first. We've got higher stocks to use, but you have this abrupt cut in demand. People lose their income all at once. And that especially hit the people who basically eat each day's food paid for by that day's wages. So the people who lost those wages in the informal sector in a lot of parts of the global south then went hungry. And they also saw a lot of their markets close. The first markets, meaning the first places that sold food to shut, were the informal markets serving those people. You saw a different kind of shock around energy as well. You saw a big shortfall in countries' revenues as a result of COVID. So that the big sources of income, for example, on the continent of Africa are to do with oil. Well, oil prices collapsed. They're to do with tourism. Tourism collapsed. They're to do with remittances. Remittances have expected to drop by over 20% globally this year. So it left only ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, which is going to be in huge demand. But Canada was one of the countries to stand up and say, we need that money for food and food security, which was good. I think a few more thoughts. I know that I'm beginning to run out of time. I would say in 2007 and 8, trade amplified the shock. Your integration into global markets in 2008 made you vulnerable. The exporters, about 30 of them, imposed bans, and it had quite negative effects in the short run for the food importers. The food importers, if they were rich enough, imported more, and that left the poorer food importers with even less access to food. So the WTO rules didn't really work in that context. They didn't, you know, there were rules controlling what you do with bans that weren't respected. And of course, you can't change the rules in a crisis. This is the point. What you want is a predictable, transparent system that's ready for the shock, because you can't expect a WTO negotiation to sort you out when the shock hits. In contrast to this time, I would say 2020, fewer bans, much more quickly lifted, although there were some countries directly affected. But you had this collapse in purchasing power at national level with foreign exchange, as well as in people's personal income. But it's not so clear to me that I think the global value chain assessment will be patchy, you know, and good in parts will be the response to whether or not it was good to be integrated into the market. There were 4 important legacies, I think, from 2007, 2008 that are worth holding on to. One was the reform of the UN Committee on World Food Security. And that did create a space where you could have ongoing discussion, where you could start to share plans, another place where you could do risk management, where you could also guide this effort to improve what we do globally for resilience, for nutrition, for food security goals. And the key thing about that reform, in my opinion, is that not only did it renew government's commitment, but it also gave seats to civil society organizations and a space for philanthropic and private sector organizations as well. It's an experiment. It struggles in some ways, but it's a very important space for the kind of integrated conversation I think we want. A second important legacy was the creation of social protection programs. By July, we had over 200 countries and territories with social protection programs in place. It's a phenomenal response. We were not able to do that in 2007, 2008. And some of them even were gender specific, giving more money to women than to men as the purveyors of food for their households. We had something called the Agricultural Market Information System, AMIS, a kind of technical body, but created quite an important practical measure for transparency in where food was grown, what the stocks were, and also a place where governments could meet and talk before they panicked. I think that was really important, and it wasn't multilateral in everybody. It was sort of focusing on where do we need this to start. I think it's done good things. And the fourth was the creation of a financial instrument that also involved recipients called the Global Agricultural Food Security Program, or GASP, coming up for renewal right now. And again, a bit neglected, I feel, in this moment, but for me, underlining this important point that you want to involve recipients of the money in the distribution of the resources. It's something we understand well as taxpayers, but not so well as global aid donors. So I think I might hand over there. The last thing I was going to say about trade, and I think Michael will probably pick up a number of points. I feel strongly that we need a World Trade Organization of some kind. We need multilateral system. We need rules. That borders do not satisfy what we need to do with the food system. It's not a national problem. And climate change is only making that very clear. We need ways in which to manage food across borders, and we need the WTO rules to go behind the border in order to do that effectively. We probably need to be less obsessed, less concerned with, we need to be concerned with many different things. We need it to be more complex in who's selling how much food where. We need it to be less driven by exporter concerns and more space for the majority of the world's countries who both import and export. The WTO needs to reflect better all of those countries' import interests. Canada imports 40% of its food, a lot of it coming from a fire zone facing record droughts. We all have these insecurities, and I think the WTO could do a better job of reflecting that, starting with a national policy in Canada that might bring that perspective into the discussion. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all of those thoughtful points, Sophia. I'll now pass it on to Michael to wrap things up.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. And I'd like to thank the organizers for this event. And I have to say, it's a rare treat to be on a panel. In trade circles, people who focus on agriculture and agricultural negotiations are are rare birds indeed. So Marie Noël, even in trade circles, that expertise is really highly valued. So to have her here is really exciting. And a lot of what I've learned over the years is actually from Sophia, even before I've met her. I've been involved in trade for about 20 years now, and it started off reading her work. And so I'm just really happy to be here and to contribute to this conversation. I'm also here as part of my mandate as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, and my first thematic report just came out. So I'm going to use this opportunity to talk about my report. Here, what I'll do is I'll post the link in the messages bit here for those of you that want to read the report. And a lot of what I've learned about food comes from the Canadian Academy. So it's appropriate for, I think, to be talking about my report for the first time here with friends and comrades. And I just also want to highlight how this report was written. It was written in the beginning of my mandate, at the beginning of the pandemic. And so how I wrote it also reflects the principles that I talk about. So how the process and product are one and the same. So this report, even though it came out of my mandate and all of that, it really came from just friendship and solidarity from people like Dina Suvala from the Australian National University, from Sandhya Pahuja at Melbourne, and Karen Smaller from IISD. Without them, this report would not have happened. Now, they might disagree with aspects of it, but their direct contribution to this report was phenomenal, and it was at a moment's notice. And also my student researcher, Sarah Davies-Breen, she was also incredible in making this happen. So this idea of friendship and solidarity, I'm going to come back to it as a value that I'm going to espouse that I think is important for trade. It also builds upon 30 years of work done by social movements, labor movements, peasant movements, and advocacy groups. And the report, I bring a long view, so to speak. So my work is always historical. I've studied the history of trade and agriculture from 1870 until today. And this report has that sort of long view into the future. And it's, I think, important in these times, in these very dark and complicated times, to keep that long view, and because change only happens when you start. You have to start somewhere. So the context of where I'm speaking from, I'm in Oregon and we're on fire. We almost had to evacuate. Oregon is an agricultural community that is export dependent, and that is also a community that is committed to always debating and discussing what is good food. So I'm lucky to call Oregon home, and it's a tough time to be here. My other home is Lebanon, and Lebanon is also on fire. Lebanon is import dependent. So when the Beirut port exploded and was devastated, that port was the source of most people's food. I believe the number is 80% of the food in Lebanon is imported. So my context, those are my contexts. And Oregon is also a settler colony. This is Kalapuya land. And Lebanon, I would say, I used to say is post-colonial, but the way the French are interfering, we're still dealing with the French. So there's an imperial history and an imperial present in play in both of my homes. So this is the context. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a brief summary of what the right to food means. And then I'll touch upon quickly just how what COVID revealed, and much of it will be really summarizing what the other speakers have said. And I just want to reiterate a couple things. Just repetition is a good way to learn things. It's how I learn. And then I'll put forward the principles of how to push us towards a more equitable trade regime from that right to food perspective. So the right to food is not just the right to be free from hunger. Food is central to how communities define themselves and constitute themselves. So in my mind, the right to food is the right for everyone to celebrate life through their meals with each other in communion. Food is how people establish their relationship with the land and water. It's therefore a key element to how sovereign power is expressed. In more specific and doctrinal terms, this means food must be three things: adequate, food must be available, and food must be accessible. So what I mean by adequate, it means that food must be good food. Communities get to decide what is good food based on their own particular conditions. Culturally, nutritionally, socially, and ecologically, communities decide what is appropriate food for themselves. So that's the first idea. So food must be adequate, food must be available. People must have a reliable source of food, whether that's feeding themselves from the land and water, or whether that's by buying food from shops and markets. The point here is whether it's about access to natural resources or access to markets, these markets and access to resources, it must be fair. So that's the idea of availability. And accessibility. Food must be accessible. People must have economic and physical access to food. That means a food system must be inclusive. In my mind, the way I think about accessibility is to think of a kitchen. The kitchen, well, however we define a kitchen, is the last place we process food before we eat it. And therefore, everyone must have access to a kitchen, however we define it. Whether that's in a hospital, a school, or it means we have the resources to cook our own food for our own families and our own communities. So that's just the right to food, broadly speaking. Now I just want to bring in the what COVID did, and then I'll turn to trade. So we've heard a lot of how COVID disrupted things and disrupted supply chains. And I find the idea of a supply chain can feel abstract at times. And we've heard the previous speakers touch upon what a supply chain is. And at the heart of these chains are food workers. And food workers really defined broadly. This can mean everyone working in the kitchen, from our homes to public institutions. It means farmers, peasants, caregivers, restaurant workers, supermarket workers. And if these workers get sick, we don't eat. That's what a disrupted supply chain means. And that's what's at stake with COVID. Now, so that's what's not working. But I want to also touch upon what is working. And here I'm really focusing on what I've seen in the most extreme situations, both in Oregon, in Lebanon, but then in my work as special rapporteur, I see firsthand, I read reports and speak directly to communities around the world on how they're dealing with the situation. And what is working, it's kind of like what Sophia said, it's not about creating new rules, but what's working is already existing networks of businesses, farms, restaurants, homes, just everyday people, neighbors, neighborhoods. And it's all of these networks, the ones that are built on trust, friendship, and solidarity. That's what's working. That's what's working in terms of people feeding each other and taking care of each other when it matters the most. What's interesting to me is, yes, COVID's a crisis, but for many communities and many people living in poverty, indigenous people, people in developing countries, women, life has always been a crisis, right? So yes, COVID is a crisis, but for many, it's always been a crisis. So if we start thinking from the perspective of those that are the most marginalized, racialized, and pushed into vulnerability, if we start, for that's actually the largest majority of people, their life has always been a food crisis. Then we start to realize, when we develop a new system, let's start there. Let's start from people's lives who's been a crisis for multiple generations. Then we learn from COVID, not as the exception, but what we learned from COVID can establish foundations for the future. So how do we take these ideas of what has been working in very localized manners and expand it into the international system, sort of building on what Marie-Noël said, a system that is transparent, that is rule-based, that is inclusive. I'll emphasize the inclusivity. So I'll start with the agreement on agriculture doesn't work. It hasn't worked by any definition. So whether you support a trade regime that prioritizes free trade, people have said, you know, the agreement on agriculture has not actually helped people who want to trade more. And then for critics of the WTO in favor of a more, let's call it a fair trade regime, who want to include other values other than free trade, they have also said it doesn't work. And this has been going on for decades. And the majority of developing countries have said it doesn't work. So it doesn't, even if you have multiple definitions of what the WTO should be about or competing values, the agreement on agriculture hasn't really worked. What it has done, in effect, separate from the theories behind it and what it has done in effect, and this started from the 1980s, from the Uruguay round negotiations, is it supported and it legitimized North American and European systems of farm support. So what it led to, the effect of the system, was it led to the significant consolidation of power in the hands of the few from primarily Europe and North America, and then globally, it created a global concentration of power. So now I'll turn to ideas for the future. So I'll focus on ideas and institutions. And so on the ideas front, new ideas, I'm calling them new ideas. They might be new for trade, but in my work, what I've been trying to do is blend human rights and a trade approach. So this is actually Sophia's work. This is an article she wrote many years ago, where she gently tells the human rights community, listen, okay, you did the critique, but where's your institutional plan. We can't be anti-trade. We must have some sort of trade regime. And then I would add then to the trade community, okay, you focused on trade, but you haven't actually paid attention to the human rights critiques that have been going on for decades. So with these ideas, they're new in that they're combining a political economy approach and a human rights approach to come forward. So the three ideas are dignity, self-sufficiency, and solidarity. So on dignity, dignity stems from the idea of the inherent worth of every human being and the respect that is due simply by virtue of being human. And so with regard to the right to food, that means everyone has the right to eat every meal with dignity. So as a matter of political process, what that means is, but if you focus on dignity, it's a way of understanding how people should relate to each other. It means that we should always be debating over the terms of common values, and then we agree to what is an appropriate international, national system based on those values and those public debates. Therefore, states must provide the necessary conditions for people to express their self-worth to each other as equals. A multilateral system that canvasses everybody's opinion and navigates amongst those competing interests. It also means that a right to food approach is not a charity approach. Charity often does away with one's dignity. It means if you need food, you're at the mercy of the benevolence of someone who decides to feed you. But it also means a right to food approach is not a food security approach. Now, those terms sometimes, and I'll sometimes use them interchangeably, I want to make a stark contrast just for the sake of argument. Food security also often ignores dignity. What it does is it focuses on the availability and accessibility side of things, supply and people's access to that supply of food, and it'll miss out adequacy, dignity, those more value-based points. And it ignores, a food security approach will often ignore the fact that people have the power and should have the power to determine for themselves what is appropriate or good food. So you can supply the right food to people and they can get the bare minimum of nutrition and calories, but it could be food that is entirely wrong for the people. It makes no sense to how they eat, and it can disrupt the social fabric of that particular community. So this dignity, by focusing on dignity, it also means a commitment to diversity, biodiversity, cultural diversity, and a diversity of supplies, or what Sophia mentioned as the redundant sources of food supply. We should be able to get our sources of food from a bunch of different places. That creates a more stable system. And that's a way of having a dignified way of being. It means you can always get access to a kitchen and cook what you need to cook. On self-sufficiency, now, this is a loaded term, and Marie-Noël touched upon it. This is a complicated and loaded term in trade circles. So what I want to do is be very clear what I mean by self-sufficiency, because there's a lot of different definitions. What I'll talk about is what it's not. Self-sufficiency is not an individualistic approach. Self-sufficiency is not a nationalistic approach, which we're seeing, and that is dangerous. And self-sufficiency is not trying to aim for autarky, meaning being a self-contained bubble, economically speaking. When I'm talking about self-sufficiency, I'm building upon a different tradition of thinking about self-sufficiency, and this is understanding self-sufficiency in relational terms. It means that nations that are self-sufficient it's about food and community that understand the symbiotic place of food and ecological systems and the fact that we all depend on each other. It means an idea of national and political systems based on principles of horizontal coexistence. It emphasizes autonomy, harmony, coexistence, respect. These are actually long-standing doctrines in international law. So if we go back to the tradition I come from, third world approaches to international law, this resonates with post-colonial governments in Bandung in 1955, again, talking about a harmonious coexistence and respect and autonomy, if not self-determination. So if self-sufficiency, if you start focusing on self-sufficiency, that we all have to live with each other, but also respect each other's autonomy in this communal, relational way, then we center on communities. It means now, in more specific terms, that policy and planning must be as localized as practical. So if we start and center and scale our thinking first on local communities, self-sufficiency places the locus of decision-making on major dimensions of food production, distribution, consumption, recycling, disposal, all of that. It starts with local communities first, then you scale out to national communities second, And then the international community is third in terms of a matter of priorities and power. The current system under the WTO kind of flips that. It focuses on the international and national to some degree and treats the local either as an afterthought or ignores it entirely. So that's self-sufficiency. I'm conscious of time, and I'll end with solidarity. That's a good place to end. So solidarity is the idea of prioritizing people and not profits. The solidarity economy is an economy that relies on organizations governed by principles of horizontal cooperation and coordination, and not this idea of profit and endless growth. In the world of food politics, for decades now, there's been two arguments, and they're always we oscillate between these two arguments, and I want to try and break through them. One argument is that economic growth will eradicate hunger and generate higher standards of nutrition. If you give everyone a job and a higher income, then they can afford good food. The other approach says, well, no, let's actually make sure we eradicate hunger. Let's eradicate hunger first, and that's a precondition for economic growth. And we go sometimes we're somewhere in between these two ideas. However, both versions still link hunger with economic growth in some way and treats the eradication of hunger as almost being synonymous with the eradication of extreme poverty. And I want to de-link those ideas, and I think that's the way forward. Because if you emphasize on growth, if you keep treating economic growth as an anchor in some way, it means it treats markets as a fact, not as something that we always are defining and redefining through social and political power. By emphasizing growth, it's never obvious, even if you get growth, how do we distribute that growth in a way that's equitable? You can have incredible growth and still have incredible inequality. That's actually more common, the way things work. And there's no inherent reason, politically and socially and morally, why income and prices should determine whether people have access to adequate food. There's nothing necessary why those should be linked. And then from a climate change perspective, the focus on economic growth is what brought us to the problems of today. And I say this being unable to breathe. So here I'm also drawing from FAO principles. I'm not coming out of the blue. They're the 10 principles of agroecology, and these approaches are built into that. The solidarity economy enables a transformative vision of human rights that doesn't just focus on sufficiency and the minimum levels of welfare. Rather, it prioritizes democratic control over food, all aspects of food, and it allows us to build an equitable and sustainable relationship, not just amongst humans, but non-human animals and the ecosystem as a whole. I can go into examples in question period, but I'll leave it there on solidarity, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, all three of you, for those really excellent and thought-provoking presentations. I think it's giving all of us a lot to think about. Before I open it up to the audience for questions, and I see, I think Jeanette already sent one. Yes, thank you, Jeanette. I want to start by giving you all a chance to respond to each other. So I'm curious, both Sophia and Marie-Noël, what do you think of Michael's kind of provocative stance on how we might change the kind of rules of trade and the kind of foundational ideas that structure those rules? And then to Michael, I'm wondering if you could speak to us with some specifics, maybe in line with Sophia's call about how you make change, how you change rules, how you change institutions in times of crisis, because what you're proposing is also a massive institutional change in many ways. And maybe you could link to some of the other institutions or changes that Sophia talked about, the Committee on World Food Security, and also to the different agreements that maybe Canada has been part of, thanks to Marie-Noël's representation at them and negotiations. So I'll pass it on to each of you to respond, and then we'll move to the questions. We have some great ones now. Suzanne's jumped in too. So Marie-Noël, I'll open it to you first.
Yes, thank you. I should respond first to Michael's remarks, certainly stating that the agreement on agriculture does not work. It is thought-provoking, especially from an agriculture negotiator, as this agreement truly is at the center of all of our trade negotiations nowadays. I would note, however, that these discussions, in most cases, are about improving it and taking stock at what worked and not worked. And I think part of it was actually answered in Sophia's presentation, in the sense that there has been a recognition since the implementation of the agreement, and that was even part of the mandate of the Doha Development Agenda, that trade agreements in the WTO are not only the instrument of exporting countries, but also have implications and can also have a positive impact in other spheres of our societies. So I want to note that trade, it can support food security, but rules-based trade is really what makes trade more effective at supporting food security. So it supports the trade of food goods and inputs through market access commitments. It brings predictability by limiting import and export restrictions. It helps limit the impact of certain domestic policies, and I named earlier in my presentation disciplines on production and trade distorting domestic support. And there even have been some developments through ministerial decisions of WTO conferences where there have been some improvements to the agreement. For example, by preventing the commercial displacement of local markets by food aid. So I really want to reiterate that this thinking has started. We can see some results of it in the Bali ministerial meeting, as well as in the Nairobi ministerial decision, where there have been new rules on international food aid, and the Bali decision talks about public stakeholding for food security purposes. So I think the perspectives have been widened. The progress is probably not as fast as we would like. And to connect quickly to Sophia's presentation, I think that a fifth legacy of the decisions that have been made after the 2007-2008 food crisis is that well, first of all, Canada as a country has made significant steps, such as untying its international development assistance, and that includes food aid. Canada took leadership in hopes that other countries can improve their record on that. And also the WTO has been making adjustments in recognition of the role of trade in preventing or precipitating a food crisis. So when we talk about the multilateral trade rules, we are talking about a set of rules that is not necessarily static, from which we need to learn and from which on which we need to make improvements. And this is exactly what's happening. And again, perhaps not at the speed that some would like, but certainly Canada is supportive of moving in that direction.
So there was, it's great to have the conversation, and there's a lot of different pieces. So I'm just going to pick up on a few things. One is, I had the title, maybe it was the only slide, well, one of the slides that wasn't seen was this idea of resilient global food security. And what I've been trying to work on when I talk about that, it's a little bit in tension with what Michael is proposing, although a lot in sympathy as well. And one of the things I would like to understand better is the subsidiarity idea, that you start local and build out. And I instead have been trying to articulate something called consonance. And this idea that at multiple scales, we need to have consonant rules. We don't need to take a WTO rule and make it our national legislation, because nationally we need other things, and nationally we respond to other pressures, and that's true of the city, and it's true of First Nations land, and it's true of different, and it's true of, you know, kind of territories like the Arctic, where we have different sovereignties. And so I think I like the idea of consonance. You know, the flute and the violin get different scores of music, but they need to play together. And a lot of the WTO rules, one way or another, have been dissonant, but so too have local and some national policies been very dissonant. I mean, the United States is most obvious and egregious at the moment in the dissonance of the money it's throwing into agriculture without regard to corporate concentration, without regard to the environment, without regard to the stability of the international system. So I feel that I'm not sure if it's important that it be local and out only, because there's so many issues that aren't obvious locally that we see if we sit together globally. So that's one idea in my principles, trying to think through what is it that we want, what would make the system more resilient. And another is adaptive governance. And I agree, Marie-Noëlle, it's an organization. We're all adaptive by being human, we're adaptive. And of course, at the moment, the WTO is paralyzed by other things than COVID. And I don't know if it will come through or not. It's not clear. You know, is this, you know, I think there will be some institution probably, but I don't know if it's a phoenix from the ashes or whether it's something recognizable. And that won't be to do with what we think about trade and solidarity. I think it'll be to do with the number of leaders in global powers right now who have a great deal of influence at the WTO, who are not committed to the vision of trade that Canada has, quite frankly. But I do think Canada, from my point of view as a citizen, I think Canada could do a better job of reflecting the import concerns we have, the supply management structures we protect, the fact that we are not comfortable members of the Cairns Group. We don't hear a lot about that in our pronouncements in Geneva. And I don't think it does anyone a favor. I think it would be better for other countries to be more honest about the fact that they're balancing competing interests, and it's not always greater trade volumes that will answer. We sometimes need to restrict trade for important reasons, and that's without prejudging whether the national systems are great. We just all carry that national politics. We should carry that politics with us, but we should be transparent about those politics. And 20 years of listening to WTO debate, India is no more honest than Canada, but we're all very, very censored when we come in as trade officials at the WTO. And I think that the Committee on Food Security is a place where you hear a much more honest exchange about what we can and can't, you know, do with the constraints. So that's and I would also say in acknowledgement of the history part too, there's a long history at the GATT of talking about this. Matthias Margalis wrote about this, but you know, it's not new for the trade forum to be carrying different agendas. The Common Agricultural Policy had a very different vision of what agriculture should be. It created a lot of problems globally that had to be resolved, but it also reflected a democratic understanding of what agriculture should be. And I think that's where, you know, just like the market needs signals to work, so does democracy need signals to work. You know, the better democracy has more signals. And we've seen, I think, in trade, this lack of signals from all of the right places. Just as in a market controlled by the state, you don't get the signals from the market actors that you might want.
This is so wonderful. Yeah, it's like 30 different ideas want to come out at the same time. Clearly there needs to be a sequel. I'm just talking to the organizers. And I look forward to having the participants jump in. I'm just seeing the questions coming in too. Okay, so on specifics. So I agree with Marie-Noëlle. Bali and Nairobi were big advancements. I was surprised. It was really a rare moment where trade negotiators and trade policy actually advanced on the issue of food security. However, Nairobi, what we saw in Nairobi then was, okay, this is a short-term response. So there was it was put off of, okay, well, we need a long-term solution to this. And that's where that's what inspired me, to be honest. If Bali and Nairobi had not happened the way they did, I wouldn't be inspired to be as bold as I am being in my report. So I'm indebted to the negotiators actually figuring something out in that short-term way at Bali and Nairobi. That is where I'm hopeful. I was hopeful in many ways. So on specifics, actually, to go to Sophia's point about GATT. So if we wind down the agreement on agriculture, we're left is GATT. GATT still acts as an anchor. And GATT was not designed, however, to deal with agriculture. GATT comes out in the 1940s, and the idea was commodity agreements, and that's what we used to do our trade and agriculture work. So institutionally and legally and structurally, it's built in there. So within GATT, you go back and it says, okay, the exception to the rule in GATT are commodity agreements, but no, those don't really exist today. In the right to food, if you look at the convention, the Human Rights Convention, where right to food is articulated, also deals with trade. So within human rights, the right to food is also a trade doctrine. So then what you can do is you take GATT and you say, okay, it says commodity agreements are the exception to GATT. You take this empty shell of the commodity agreement and we redefine them and we call them international food agreements. Commodity agreements for supply management, and Canada still has a tradition of supply management to some degree. In agricultural circles, supply management has its benefits and detriments. But what I'm saying is commodity agreements shouldn't just be supply management. We then bring these new ideas that we've had in the last several decades, and we bring a human rights approach, and we think of international food agreements being the new vehicle to then put forward and debate all these different ideas, where it aligns with GATT, it's still within the trade regime, it still is rules-based and transparent and creates a predictable system where we're negotiating and managing different interests. But in a way where we don't have to renegotiate the infrastructure, right? And it would look different than regional trade agreements, because regional trade agreements are preferential agreements that are about connecting economies in a way where and the people who usually benefit from regional trade agreements are importers and exporters, but that doesn't necessarily serve people's food needs, right? It integrates companies together in a way, and regional trade agreements aren't really, I haven't seen them as a way to really serve that broader understanding of food and the right to food. So the structure is there. So you wind down the agreement on agriculture, you still have GATT, and then in legal terms, GATT gives you commodity agreements, and then we can take a ministerial decision, we can take an interpretive guide, we can reinterpret what a commodity agreement, turn it into that food agreement. On the point of consonance and the local versus the global, this is, I like Sophia's terminology of consonance, and her music background is totally coming through, versus dissonance. Edward Said, who's also influenced me, he also was influenced by these musical metaphors. So for me, the reason I emphasize the local, so I like this idea, it makes perfect sense. I rely more, and I apologize for being a bit theoretical, but for students of theory out there, on Boa Santos's idea of interlegality. So the way is, imagine a space, and it's just a jumble of laws, all different types of laws. Local, international, domestic, indigenous, traditional, formal, informal, all of them operating, soft law, hard law, whatever. And they're operating in a way that's quite coherent, in that the actors in that space use all these different laws and navigate and negotiate, and it comes out in a particular way. And ideally, it's a constant, it's in that more harmonious way, is the ideal. The reason, however, that I focus on the local is then to bring in the democratic element. CFS aside, very few other, and the ILO to some degree, very few international institutions make space for a more democratic intervention for people, for this idea of multi-scalar governance operating at the same time at the international scale. The Committee on World Food Security it is an experiment, and people are struggling to save that space for civil society. And whether the CFS will survive this particular crisis is also an open question. Can it advance to be more responsive as an open? ILO, with its tripartite system, with labor, private sector, with labor management and governments, is also an idea. So I'll say I'm more ambivalent in terms of the ability of international institutions for making space for that more democratic intervention. That's why I emphasize the local. And you can imagine a system, so you can imagine the CFS, for example, or the ILO making space for local government, for city governments then having its own space, for example, or somehow in the mix. That's possible. So then the international question becomes, so if we have these international food agreements, the international question becomes, which organization will manage the interface of all these food agreements? Interface is an old idea from the GATT days. That's how they used to talk about economies. You had different types of economies trying to interface in a particular way. Now, it could be the WTO, Politically, maybe, who knows, but it could be the CFS, it could be the ILO. I mean, we could go through all the acronyms, right? But it could be any multilateral institution that makes space for these international food agreements that would be aligned with GATT and all of that, but where the politics and all of the action happens is in that space. I just want to touch on one question on hope. This was from Sarah, who asked the question? It was from
Sarah Berger Richardson.
Yes, Sarah Berger is, so I put forward these principles. Why, how can one be hopeful? So I'm going to draw from Lebanon here. I don't use the language of hope or cynical. There's no choice. There's no choice but to think of transformative change for the future. When your country implodes, when your forests are on fire, when you can't breathe, when white nationalists are on the streets, when climate change is here, hope is a luxury. This is necessity. So the idea of change and transformative change and organizing amongst ourselves and working together, those are the examples I drew from. People don't form mutual aid societies and networks because they like their neighbor. Community gives this fuzzy, warm feeling of we're all going to get along. Community is people you're stuck living with and you have to learn to live with each other somehow. It's necessity, right? So a community-based approach comes out of necessity. Am I hopeful? Today, absolutely not. But am I going to continue struggle and make new friends and continue making the world better for my kids and his kids and etc.? Of course, there's no other choice but to struggle and organize.
Perfect. Thank you for all of that amazing input. I'll now I'm turning just to the chat, and I see that we have a number of questions here. I can start with Jeanette. If you would like to ask the question yourself, I can just unmute you, and that way we have it on the record if you're comfortable speaking up and having it recorded.
Yes, hello.
Perfect, yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you very much for the panel today. I think it's wonderful that the CAF-LFP has organized these. Looking forward to more. And thank you to each individual panelist for your presentation. Mike, I don't want to expand the discussion too much, but just wondering how this now relates more to the private sector and the lack of competition law at an international level that can serve to regulate some of the incredible corporate concentration, which has a dramatic impact on trade, of course, as you know, with very few companies having so much control over trade in major foodstuff and commodities. Any comments on that in relation to some of the ideas that have been presented today? Thank you.
We'll just collect a couple questions before we turn it back to you. So, Suzanne?
It should be open and...
This is a fascinating discussion. I also really appreciate the organizers and the panelists for what you talked about and shared today. I'm interested, I think the rules-based system that especially Marie-Noelle was emphasizing, we're seeing that it is weakening, that even where in the past it didn't really serve developing countries, which was mentioned, now it's not serving middle powers like Canada, and that what happens as that rules-based system break down more to those with more power and money.
Perfect. And I'll just allow maybe one more question and then we can move through the three. So I see if you would like to pose your question.
Thank you. I was just having my daughter on my lap, so I preferred being moved, but so I was just curious about Michael's comment on what he made about the right to food not exactly being the food security approach, and what would that mean for the prospective change on how we understand the right to food, and how that would change the four basic pillars that the right to food actually is inherently relying upon through food security. Thank you.
Perfect. So maybe we'll turn those 3 questions over to our panelists, and then we can move through the others that come up. So maybe starting with Michael, because I guess you had that direct question. It's fresh in your mind.
Talk too much, you should have ended with me, but I'll be brief. So I'll start with the direct question and then move up on this idea of the right to food not being food security. So the classic example, and this is from Raj Patel, tells this story. You can have a food secure system in jail, right? You can give people nutritious, adequate, culturally appropriate food in an inherently unjust system, such as a prison. And so that's a stark example. What it means more specifically, Marie-Noël mentioned the Food Systems Summit that's coming up in 2021 in the fall. That's coming out of the Secretary General's office. What's interesting to me is human rights is not central to the vision so far. I've met with the organizers. I've sort of looked at all the documents so far, and there isn't a right to food, human rights broadly, or a right to food as part of that. And what that means something very specific. One, that means everyone's treated as a so-called stakeholder, and they're treating governments and individuals and communities as stakeholders that are all the same. When you're a rights holder, that means you have power to claim you're entitled. You have more power to dictate the agenda. The other thing about the right to food specifically, and when it comes to the Food Systems Summit, it means that certain ideas are not given a dominance or predominantly put forward. The main one being agroecology. So agroecology is an approach that builds on both experimental and experiential knowledge. So you could call it science and traditional knowledge, and puts forward an idea that you cannot separate social dynamics from ecological dynamics. And there's experiments, and there's already things in practice. And the agroecological approach is in line inherently with the right to food approach. So if you put forward a right to food approach, you by definition have to prioritize agroecology as an idea. And this is an idea that's being debated in FAO, in the Committee of World Food Security. It's a mainstream idea that's everywhere, that's used in multiple countries. But by not having a human rights approach in the Food Systems Summit, the idea of agroecology has been in effect, and it's not clear because they're still organizing, whether it's marginalized or excluded, and that's the fight. So I spend my time, unfortunately, then I have to spend my time, one, arguing why human rights matters, as opposed to getting to the details of, okay, let's all agree human rights matters, and let's work out each different food system, the differences here, the differences there, and get to business in a way that starts with a position that people have the power to determine their own destiny and to hold companies and governments accountable. Accountability, that's the other part that's important. So when you take out a human rights approach, you diffuse this idea of accountability, and it just becomes stakeholders, and we all talk and hang out and develop non-binding principles, and it just becomes amorphous, and it's unclear what's at play, which sort of leads to the question of concentration of corporate power. One question is, yeah, competition law matters, but also what is it about the current system that led to that concentration of power? That's part of my frustration with the agreement on agriculture. Is it contributed in many ways, between working with the mix of domestic and international systems has led to this concentration of power. So yes, we need some sort of competition law, but also undoing all the conditions that led to that concentration of power. And if the rule-based system is weakening, what will happen when it breaks? That's what we're finding out every day when we wake up, and that's why we're here.
Perfect. And then perhaps Marie-Noël, you would like to jump in and comment on one of the 2 first questions that were posed?
Yes, of course. From a trade negotiator's perspective, I'll focus on Ms. Armstrong's question. So a rules-based system is the alternative to a strength-based system. Without it, smaller and middle powers are in a less desirable situation, which is why Canada values it so much and has been active with other middle powers towards improving, repairing, saving what we have at the WTO. So a lot of the work at the Ottawa group is about finding alternatives to ensure the long-standing existence of a rules-based system. And so we can resume as well the negotiations that have been ongoing in agriculture and outside of agriculture as well.
Thank you. And then perhaps, Sophia, you could take the first and final question there.
Well, I don't have I think competition is a huge issue. I've been working on it for a very long time. I think that one of the reasons the WTO stalled on it was because the definition of competition that the champions put forward was foreign companies' right to compete in another country's domestic market, which of course was always going to be politically much more difficult than what do we do with the oligopolies we have? And the answer to that had been, but you mustn't have any state trading, you know. So we sort of took you saw governments take a kind of ideological stand. If it's state run, it's bad. If it's private, we don't deal with it. And that allowed, I think, a further concentration. The state response was the kind of second best. I think it is second best, but it's pretty damn good. And we don't have a lot of first best solutions available to us. The even less good was allow the existing oligopoly of grain traders, for example, to take over your state monopoly, which is what more or less has happened in Canada and Australia and elsewhere, although there are differences. So is there a competition agenda? I think we have some work to do nationally to work out what we would want before we would be ready to go to the global conversation. I think the extraordinary power of certain companies like Amazon, the extraordinary money that's being made. I mean, just entre autres, Cargill posted a record return for its 32, whatever it is, 130 family members, 32 board members this year. COVID has been very, very good for some actors. And part of that is in a crisis, the larger and more, you know, the more power you have, there's been a lot of shakeout for smaller actors because there's less confidence, and the higher the risk goes, the bigger pockets you need to have to ride out the storm. So we have big competition challenges to understand, and I don't think we're ready yet to see that happen globally. But maybe these commodity agreements that Michael is floating, they were agreements partly to offset the power of suppliers to the market and the fears of importers from those commodity agreements. Are there some places where we could have the conversation to say the market doesn't actually work the way it's meant to, the benefits of liberalizing trade don't accrue as they should? This is one of the reasons why. But I think we're a long way from a definition of competition even that would allow us to know what it was we were going to pursue. I just want to say lastly, I wouldn't agree that the South doesn't get anything out of the WTO. But one, I don't think there's a South at the WTO. And in agriculture, it's, you know, exporters and imports don't cut nicely. I don't want to diminish in any way the legacy of colonialism or what the meaning of global South is, but it's very, to me anyway, I find it's very difficult to have a coherent conversation about trade rules and agriculture from the perspective that there's a South perspective, a single South perspective. And I would say, although it has paralyzed the WTO, there has been a lot of adaptation. Who decides the little core group includes India and China now. It's 4 countries basically. Well, it's the European Union, the United States, India and China are critical to any discussion. And Brazil, somewhat, that goes up and down. But that is not who decided the Uruguay round. And I think that it's important for us to be clear about that, and that there's a lot of work within the global South still to do, and a lot of thinking to be done. And I think middle powers like Canada also, in Karen's group, it's not my favorite agenda, but that Karen's group is an interesting example that predates all that. That said, we have shared interests, whether some of you are Soviet members of the, you know, Eastern European bloc, some of us are developing countries. We all have some problems with a system that has overflow that hurts us. I think multifunctional agriculture would have a lot of resonance for many, many, many developing countries. So throw that in there.
Yeah, so thank you for all of that. I see that we have about 5 minutes left, so perhaps I'll just pull 1 or 2 more questions from the audience, and then we can quickly wrap up. So maybe I'll turn to Steve Supa, and I'll just unmute you for a moment so you can quickly pose your question.
I sent it in writing, but the question is this: in trade negotiations, traditionally, you always have trade-offs, concessions that are given, and the question is, so, and that's under mercantilist logic, and the question is, you know, under that logic, what kind of trade-offs would you have regarding climate change measures? You know, for example, carbon border tariffs, would that be a very effective climate change measure?
Thank you. I'll just allow Esteban to ask his question, and then we can wrap up with those two.
You're muted.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Hi, my name is Esteban. I'm a third-year law student here at UBC. Before I joined Allard, I was working with Food Matters Manitoba, a food security organization in Winnipeg. You know, we established local food council there in Winnipeg, and I was wondering if you could tell me what food councils could do to challenge food insecurity all over Canada right now, especially given the COVID challenges. Service will be gone very soon, and food security is definitely going to rise given that unemployment will be increasing in Winnipeg and all over Canada. Thank you.
We're going to give each of you 1 minute for your final words and response to our last two questions. And then we'll end with just a quick comment from Victoria and I. So you're on the clock. Sophia, you can go first this time.
Well, I'm going to leave. I'm hoping Marie-Noelle has an answer to Steve's question, which is a great question, but I don't have a quick answer for it. And on food councils, I want to say, I think that the food councils already are providing an important counterpoint in the Canadian conversation about what to do. So we don't just have surplus disposal happening. And the first attempt to deal with surplus disposal didn't involve the food banks. The second attempt did. And I think the food councils have affected a lot how food banks work and what they do. There's lots to fix. But I think the food council concept, which took, you know, trying to end hunger in the community and turned it into a center of thinking about what role does food play. A lot of the things that Michael was talking about in terms of dignity, inclusiveness, solidarity. The Canadian Food Councils are an example to the world, and so I think that there's lots more to be done, but it's as a voice in determining what we should be doing. I think there's the beginnings of that change, and I hope that they'll be not angry, but aggressive, assertive in being heard, because we need to keep pushing Canadian food policy into more responsive to people's hunger and less responsive to surpluses of potatoes.
And Marie-Noelle, perhaps you can go next and spearhead Steve's question.
Yes, of course. So as a negotiating body, the WTO works by consensus. Yes, eventually in a negotiating process, multilaterally, there can be trade-offs. But at the beginning, the parties that are negotiating, so in this case, the entire WTO membership has to agree on principles and on a framework. At this point in time, including climate change in such a framework would be challenging, to say the least. This is not something I can see happening in the near term. And again, I think the negotiations can only move once all members agree on which principles to address, advance, and follow. It's a matter of achieving that level of agreement.
Perfect. And then any closing remarks are left to you, Michael.
What they said, basically. So what I mean, exactly what Marie-Noelle's expertise I defer to, and Sophia exactly on the food councils. And then to add another point then, the second task would be for food councils. This would be in the future, is then to understand how the international does determine the domestic in many ways and vice versa. So can food councils then work transnationally, much like many unions can work transnationally, sort of thinking of things in those terms. That would be what my addition to that.
So our time has come to an end, but I just wanted to, on behalf of the Canadian Association for Food Law and Policy, which I didn't really introduce at the beginning because if you're here, I assume you know who we are, but thank you so much for coming and for taking the time to chat with us. I think this has been exactly what we wanted, a real kind of chance to discuss the issues in a non-super political way and really kind of get at some of the heart of the challenges that face us and the possible solutions. So thank you, all three of you, so much. And for those of you who don't know the Canadian Association for Food Law and Policy that well, but are here, please consider joining us. Our website is foodlaw.ca, and we'll be putting up a blog post about this event and posting our other events there. You can also join us at Food Law Canada on Twitter. And I know we have a Facebook page, and I do not know what it's called, but if you look around there, you'll find us, the Canadian Association for Food Law and Policy, or Food Law Canada, or Food Lawyers Canada. We'd love to have you join us. So thank you again to all of you, and we'll be in touch. Stay safe, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.